On the evening of Christmas Eve 2002, Scott Peterson arrived home to his house in Modesto, California. He had been out since the morning. He was still wearing the clothes he had put on before leaving. He said he had been fishing. His wife Laci was not there. Her car was in the driveway. Their golden retriever, Mackenzie, was in the back garden, wearing his leash. But there was no sign of Laci. Scott Peterson called his mother-in-law. He told her he had come home and Laci was gone. That evening, Laci's stepfather called the police to report her missing. Laci Peterson was 27 years old. She was 8 months pregnant. Her due date was February 10, 2003. She and Scott had already chosen a name for the baby boy she was carrying. His name would be Conner. Neither Laci nor Conner would ever come home. What happened to them in those hours on Christmas Eve, and who is responsible, has been the subject of one of the most ferocious true crime debates in American history for nearly a quarter of a century. Scott Peterson was convicted of their murders in 2004. He has maintained his innocence ever since. The case continues to generate new legal filings, new documentaries, and new arguments in 2026. This is the full story of Laci and Scott Peterson. Laci Denise Rocha was born on May 4, 1975, in Modesto, California. She was, by all accounts from those who loved her, exactly the kind of person who lit up a room. Warm, enthusiastic, generous. She loved to cook. She loved entertaining. She idolized Martha Stewart. She was the kind of young woman who threw herself into the things she cared about with complete commitment. She met Scott Lee Peterson while they were both students at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. He was studying agriculture. She was studying horticulture. They married in August 1997 and settled in Modesto, close to Laci's family. Scott worked as a fertilizer salesman, a job that required frequent travel around California. Laci worked various jobs but had one primary goal. She wanted to be a mother. Friends and family remembered her excitement when she discovered she was pregnant in 2002. She decorated a nursery. She chose the name Conner. She was, by every account, utterly joyful. Those who knew Scott described him differently. Charming. Handsome. A little distant. Someone who seemed more ambivalent about impending fatherhood than his wife was about motherhood. In November 2002, 6 weeks before Laci disappeared, Scott was introduced by a friend to a Fresno massage therapist named Amber Fry. He told Fry he was single. They began a romantic relationship. He was not single. His wife was at home in Modesto, 8 months pregnant with his son. The last confirmed sighting of Laci Peterson alive was the evening of December 23, 2002, when she and Scott visited her sister Amy's hair salon. Amy cut Scott's hair, as she did every month. Laci's mother spoke with Laci by phone that evening around 8:30. Laci confirmed she and Scott would attend a Christmas Eve family dinner the following night. On the morning of December 24th, Scott Peterson said he last saw Laci at around 9:30 a.m. He said she was watching television in her nightgown and had planned to walk Mackenzie around the neighborhood later that morning. He said he had originally intended to play golf but changed his mind and decided to go fishing instead. He drove roughly 90 miles west to the Berkeley Marina on San Francisco Bay. He launched a 14-foot aluminum boat he had purchased 15 days earlier, a purchase he had told nobody about. He fished for a few hours. He drove home. When he arrived home, Laci was gone. Mackenzie was in the garden, still wearing his leash. Police arrived that evening. Detectives who spoke with Scott Peterson in the early hours of Christmas morning later described his demeanor as unusual. He was not asking the questions they expected from a husband whose 8 months pregnant wife had vanished. He was not pressing them for updates. He was not demanding answers. One retired detective described him as projecting a strange combination of polite and arrogant, disaffectedly distant and impatiently irritable. He did not seem, the detective said, like a man who was crushed by what had happened. He refused to take a polygraph test. On December 30, 2002, 6 days after Laci was reported missing, Amber Fry contacted Modesto police. She told investigators she had been dating Scott Peterson since November 20th. He had told her he was single. He had also told her in early December, weeks before Laci disappeared, while his wife was still alive, that he had lost his wife and that this would be his first Christmas alone. On December 9th, Fry later testified, Scott had told her he had been married but that his wife had recently died. Laci Peterson was alive on December 9, 2002. She was 8 months pregnant with their son. Investigators asked Amber Fry to help them. She agreed. Beginning in late December and continuing through January, Fry wore a recording device and made phone calls to Scott Peterson, who was by then appearing on national television as a grieving husband searching for his missing wife. On January 1, 2003, 1 minute after midnight on New Year's Day, Scott Peterson called Amber Fry to wish her a Happy New Year. He told her he was in Europe. He was in Modesto, California, watching coverage of his missing wife on cable news. On January 24, 2003, Fry held a press conference alongside her attorney, Gloria Allred. The revelation of the affair, and of Scott's lies to Fry about his wife's death, fundamentally altered the public's perception of Scott Peterson. Investigators had already been suspicious. Now they had something approaching motive. The search for Laci Peterson consumed the Christmas season and stretched into the new year. Hundreds of volunteers participated in searches across Modesto. Tips poured in from across the country. Laci's face was on billboards, on television, and eventually on the nation's most-watched morning programs. On April 13, 2003, a partial set of human remains washed ashore near Point Isabel on the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay. The following day, April 14, a fetus washed ashore nearby. DNA testing confirmed what investigators had feared. The remains were those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son Conner. They had been found less than 2 miles from where Scott Peterson said he had been fishing on Christmas Eve. On April 18, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested in La Jolla, California. He had dyed his hair blonde. He had grown a goatee. He was carrying nearly $15,000 in cash, multiple credit cards, his brother's identification, and a map to the home of Amber Fry. Investigators said he appeared to be preparing to flee. He pleaded not guilty. The trial of Scott Peterson began on June 1, 2004, in Redwood City, California, after being moved from Modesto. It lasted 19 weeks. It drew comparisons to the O.J. Simpson trial in its capacity to divide the nation and dominate cable news coverage. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial. There was no eyewitness. There was no murder weapon. There was no blood found in the Peterson home. No forensic evidence directly placed Scott Peterson at the scene of a crime. What the prosecution had was a pattern. The secret boat purchase 15 days before the disappearance. The secret affair and the lies about being a widower before Laci's body was found. The proximity of the remains to the fishing location. The fact that investigators said they could not eliminate Scott Peterson as the only suspect. The only thing we couldn't eliminate was Scott, retired Detective John Bueller said. The prosecution argued Scott had murdered Laci on the night of December 23 or in the early morning of December 24, possibly by strangulation, transported her body in his boat, and dumped it in San Francisco Bay weighted down with concrete anchors he had made in his office. The bodies had decomposed over months in the water before washing ashore near his fishing location. The defense, led by celebrity attorney Mark Garagos, argued the prosecution had built a case entirely on conjecture. There was no direct evidence. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Laci walking the dog in the neighborhood after the time Scott claimed to have left the house, which, if true, would mean she was alive after he had gone. Garagos pointed to a burglary at the house across the street from the Petersons on the morning of Christmas Eve and suggested Laci may have been abducted by the men responsible. The turning point came in August 2004, when Amber Fry took the stand. For 7 days, she described her relationship with Scott Peterson, the lies he had told her, the calls she had recorded at police request in which he described himself as a man living in Paris while his pregnant wife's name dominated the national news. Jurors heard 12 hours of recorded calls. They heard Scott Peterson laugh. They heard him flirt. They heard him describe to his girlfriend, in real time, the vigils being held for his missing wife, while giving no indication he knew where she was. Legal analysts identified Frey's testimony as the moment the prosecution's momentum became unstoppable. On November 12, 2004, after 7 days of deliberation, during which 2 jurors were replaced, the jury found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci and second-degree murder for the death of Conner. Crowds outside the courthouse cheered when the verdict was announced. In March 2005, He was sentenced to death. Scott Peterson has spent over 2 decades fighting his conviction. He has maintained, through every legal proceeding, through every media appearance permitted to him, and through multiple filings professing his love for Laci, that he did not kill his wife. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court issued a significant ruling, not on his guilt, but on the conduct of the trial itself. The court found that a juror had failed to disclose during selection that she had previously sought a restraining order while pregnant, a detail that should have excluded her from a case involving a murdered pregnant woman. Peterson's death sentence was overturned. He was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 2021. His murder convictions were upheld. In January 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project, a non-profit organization that investigates cases of potential wrongful conviction, announced it was taking up Scott Peterson's case. Their investigation centered on 2 areas that Geragos had raised in the original trial but which never fully received proper examination. The first was the DNA evidence from the van. On Christmas Eve 2002, the same morning Laci went missing, a house directly across the street from the Petersons was burgled. The thieves used a van that was later found in the airport district of Modesto, burned out. Inside the van was a mattress. Evidence was collected from the van and the mattress. Geragos said he learned, on the day of Peterson's conviction, that this evidence had been gathered and then effectively suppressed, never tested, never disclosed to the defense in a timely manner. The evidence was collected and tested, Geragos said at CrimeCon in May 2026, and it was deep-sixed until decades later. The Innocence Project has argued that DNA testing of the mattress could link the burglars, and potentially Laci's disappearance, to someone other than Scott Peterson. Prosecutors have opposed the DNA testing and fought to keep Peterson in prison. The second area involved the timeline. The Innocence Project argued that the prosecution's theory of when Laci died was based on methods that would not meet modern scientific standards, and that updated forensic techniques placed the window of her death at a time when Scott Peterson was verifiably away from a house. In August 2025, the Los Angeles Innocence Project filed a formal habeas corpus petition in San Mateo County Superior Court, alleging that Scott Peterson was wrongfully convicted based on false evidence. The petition raised 14 separate claims, including prosecutorial suppression of evidence, junk science presented to the jury, and constitutional violations of Peterson's right to a fair trial. On April 29, 2026, San Mateo Superior Court Judge Elizabeth Hill denied the petition in full. In the ruling, the judge rejected all 14 claims, describing them as procedurally barred, lacking merit, or both. The LA Innocence Project said it disagreed with the ruling on every level, calling it a profound misunderstanding and misapplication of the law applied to habeas corpus petitions. Peterson's attorneys announced they would appeal to a higher court. On July 16, 2026, A&E premieres Scott Peterson, The New Evidence, a 2-part documentary in which former defense attorney Mark Geragos, retired LAPD detective Nanette Tuzby, and legal analyst Chris Pixley re-examine the case, the suppressed van evidence, and the arguments that the wrong man is in prison. The prosecution, including the star prosecutor from the original trial, maintains that Scott Peterson is guilty and that no DNA testing is necessary to prove it. Scott Peterson is currently incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison in California. He is 52 years old. He has been in prison for over 20 years for murders he says he did not commit. Whatever the truth is about what happened in the Peterson household on Christmas Eve 2002, and the courts have now reached their conclusion about that truth multiple times, the center of this story is a young woman who deserved to hold her son. Laci Peterson was 27 years old. She had decorated a nursery. She had chosen a name. She was 4 weeks from meeting Conner. She and Conner were found in April 2003, in the water near where her husband said he had gone fishing. Her family has lived with that image ever since. Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, became a national advocate for victims of violent crime. In 2004, the same year Scott was convicted, Congress passed the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, often referred to as Laci and Conner's Law, which allows separate murder charges for the death of a fetus during a violent federal crime. Something was named for Laci and Conner. That is the smallest possible comfort for what was taken from them. The A&E documentary, premiering July 16th, will not resolve whether Scott Peterson is guilty or innocent. No documentary can. But it will raise the questions that 22 years of legal proceedings have not definitively answered, about the van, about the mattress, about the evidence that was gathered and then set aside. America has been arguing about this case since 2002. It will still be arguing about it when the appeals court rules. Subscribe to Quick Crime Vault. Every case in this vault deserves to be told completely, especially the ones where the full truth may still be out there.